So this is part 3 of my commentary on Proverbs chapter 19. I left off last time with verse 17. I'll continue now with verse 18. Chasten your son while there is hope, and let not your soul spare for his crying. Now this is a verse that we've seen before. So on the surface, I think this verse is readily understandable. To chasten one's son is to discipline one's son. Or more specifically, the word chasten means to have a restraining or a moderating effect on. Now, of the reasons why a son might require this sort of thing is fairly straightforward. A son, perhaps a young son at that, has not encountered many life experiences. There has been not enough action-reaction type observation such that appropriate behavior is learned. There are mistakes to be made in life and lessons learned from those mistakes. There are also mistakes that are lofty enough that for the rest of one's days they will be unable to recover from them. And certainly, it is the role of the father to step in before the mistake of such a magnitude for which the son's future is put in jeopardy, and to put him on a correct path. Now, of restraint and moderation I've talked about quite a bit, more so in terms of the broad general sense of that restraining element. That there is an aspect of the restraint that is negative, and there is an aspect of the restraint that is positive. Too much restraint leads to a suffocating environment, and it's prone to tyranny. An environment in which there is not enough restraint, I think, is prone again to the same tyranny. It is too open, too difficult to identify that which is true. And there are different contexts, there are different situations in which restraints should be loosened or tightened. It's a fairly complex matter. Now, what I find interesting is the context in which we find this restraining element. Now, the chasten, this is the restraining element, chasten your son, the restraining element on the part of a father, while there is still hope. And the question is, well, hope for what? I think there are a few different avenues that can open before us here. Hope, of course, for the future. Perhaps we can further ask the question, well, what do we mean by that? Now, I've alluded to it when I said that it is possible to make such a mistake because of the lack of restraint, that there are so many possibilities of action and of behavior that a son can perform, he can throw out into the world, that the likelihood that he will stumble upon a trap, or perhaps not even a trap, but that he will stumble in general and injure himself, I think is quite high. Now, when I say stumble and injure, of course, I mean this in the metaphorical sense. It could be literal too, but the restraints that I consider here to be of utmost importance is that of the moral, the ethical. Now, the reason I say that, because what one considers to be right and what one considers to be wrong is going to govern the foundation. It is the starting point for which a person makes their decisions. All decisions. And of course, accidents can happen, but insofar as accidents are controllable by the tightening of some restrictions, I think to a greater degree accidents can be avoided by not tightening the physical restriction, such as keeping a son within the home so he doesn't go out, so that probability for him getting injured, physically harmed, is low, but rather it is tightening the restriction on the individual that is the son. It is, perhaps restriction here is the wrong word. It is not, the father doesn't need to be the tyrant, but rather it is a tightening, it is a growing, a facilitation of that thing, that ability of the son to identify that which needs to be a restraining element. And I think giving somebody the method or the tools to discover the natural regulating agent within, I think is better than that of a yes, no, do this, do not do that type of direction. Now this leads me to hope. For the hope of a father, I would imagine, is quite large. The father wants good things for his son. The interesting thing here is the possibility of something being too far gone, of the relationship of something within the son, perhaps on the part of the father, for which the son can no longer be redeemed, that there is no hope for his future. And what do I mean by hope for the future? Well, it is to some degree a desire, it is a want. But that's not all that it is, because it is grounded in something rich. Because there are many desires, there are many wants. And certainly there are cases in which families want and desire things for their children that they believe are right, but perhaps they are wrong for the child. This relationship is a difficult one. But the main point is here that at the bottom of it is love. And from that place, I think it's much more likely to be truly interested and truly concerned about the future of one's offspring. And that within these desires, within the expectations, at the bottom, usually, there is that love. And so, as far as we can say of desires and of expectations that are superficial, that are partial, with the influence of love, again, there is room for mistake here. It's not a 100% type of deal, but it's facilitatory. I think of the analogy of a filter. Much is avoided through the filter of love. Much can be accomplished through the filter of love. Now, on the other side of hope, not of hope, but the other side, I should say, where hope is on one side of our landscape, and on the other side there is the beyond. not the beyond in the good sense, it is beyond hope. Again, we return to this space. In the first instance, we really did not go very far. Now, of the devices that we have discussed to prevent the sun, the image in my mind is the sun is at the precipice of something. That something is, on the one hand, hope with all of its green grass, and on the other side is this darkness. Darkness that to him seems like a landscape for which he can illuminate. But it's deceptive, for the darkness is not for him to illuminate. It is the darkness that would consume him. And in this situation, of course, the Father sees this darkness, and by love it prompts him to action. And in his action, he is disposed to many different tools, some of which we've already mentioned. The tool of restraint, the tool of absolute restraint, which I think is fine, depending on the situation. There is the facilitatory restraint, meaning that the Father, over time, works to develop within the Son an apparatus such that the Son is able to make wise and effective decisions. And as such, the Son will effectively walk himself off of and away from the ledge because of the instruction and the wisdom of the Father. Of course, depending on the circumstance, if the Son is in immediate danger, that type of discipline, the type of punishment that gets the point across so sharply is necessary. Now, for a moment, as we reflect on the illustration that is appearing before us, this long boundary upon which the Son has this sort of euphoric excitement about discovering that other side that is obscured from his vision, his understanding. The Father that stands behind them, that sees what is happening, and that is aware. What can we say of the beyond if the Son is to fall into that darkness? We could say any number of examples that we may find in the world, but what we are after here is the bottom of it, regardless of the reason, regardless of perhaps the individual experience that causes him to leap from that hopeful, lush side of the world, that green grass, the strong family, the secure relational bonds, to that of destitution, of desperation, of hunger, intellectual poverty, perhaps drug addiction. By extension, we can think of a self that has been captured, a self that has been denied, a self that denies the self, a self that denies the self to such a degree that it is its own existence is the denial of its existence. Of course, at its extreme, we find suicide. Anything for which that conscious mind, the perception of and the understanding, the reception of the good has been disrupted. When the human being, when the Son becomes a vehicle not for light, but for darkness, then hope is lost. Now what's interesting is the conception, the idea of redemption, of salvation, and I think the New Testament comes to us here. Salvation, redemption, this is not a light subject of a man that finds himself so far deep into that pit of Sheol, that he is unable to see a way out. It almost requires that love, the love of the family, of the father, whatever, to rescue him from it, to again introduce that light to him. Now surely there are many ways by which this light can find a person. Now the second half of this verse, and let not your soul spare for his crying. To my mind, I read into this, I think, superficially. What I hear is, don't worry too much about his crying, because what you are doing for him is for his own good, and that the only reason that you would spare for his crying is because you valued his distress over that which you are trying to accomplish, which of course, making the judgment of that which is to save the son in the long run, is certainly much more valuable than the present crying. Now I think, although I said that this is superficial, I think that this is an accurate analysis. However, the language that is used here is, I find difficult because of my modern sensibility. My use of language, in terms of this, the meaning of language, has, I think, severely been impacted by the age. And so, if I was to examine this perhaps a little bit more attentively, I think it requires a discussion of the soul again. I say again from the previous episode. It requires understanding the soul and its relationship to behavior and action, because in this second half of this verse, the individual's soul is behaving, it is sparing, or it is restraining itself from sparing, I should say. And let not your soul spare for his crying. And perhaps I should have asked myself at the outset, rather than saying, I think this to be the case, is to ask the question, is it the case that I'm reading into this superficially? And then the exploration should move from there. So, okay, the soul. The soul is in some sense, the immortal part of man. It is that bit of him that is the slice of consciousness that has been afforded to all conscious perceiving beings from the source of that consciousness, we can say. Or we can also say that by circumstance, man finds himself in a particularly interesting state in which he is afforded this mind for which he is able to illuminate the reality around him. Again, there, if one is to have the faith in God, is to have a faith in God, then there is a through line, there is a connectedness to that thing that is beyond. A little side note, I hear a lot of talk these days about this being a simulation, and it's bizarre that language is coming up, since we have such a rich history of exploring just this, essentially, of man finding himself existing in a world that has been created, that has been that is running on some superordinate conscious software that he is sort of the beneficiary of. But nevertheless, man in this way if we think about man in this way, about being a part of something that is sort of interconnected, now man and his individuality and of his will, it is a potentially perverting thing to understand exactly where he is in all of this within his existence. But insofar as that his soul is a part of something greater, and the action of his soul, perhaps of his will, no matter how small, does have some impact on the conscious landscape, we can say the sacrifice, which is what this is, the sacrifice is for greater mind. It is for the restriction, the pulling back of that of another mind from jumping into the pit of darkness inadvertently under some false perception, false pretext. And now this explanation is certainly somewhat familiar, or somewhat similar, familiar and similar, to the explanation that I gave at the outset. And yet we come to it through, I think, more of an expansive understanding. And I think this is more appropriate of an understanding of why one ought to do something. And of course, it comes on the heels of our previous interpretation of the first half of the verse and the illustration at the boundary point of the intelligible and not necessarily unintelligible, but rather intelligence reducing. Because it's not a quality in the darkness in and of itself that is that contains unintelligibleness. It is what can we say? Perhaps within the darkness, because surely there is darkness that is unaware. Or perhaps I should say that there is darkness that is out there that is imperceptible at a given moment. And it is afforded perceptibility when a conscious mind attends to it. Now there are so many gradations of this in terms of the fractal structure in which it spins my head to think about, such just being in the room that I'm in. My eyes are open, I'm looking straight ahead of me, but even the degree to which I'm attending to the inputs that surround me are limited because I'm focused on this podcast. And of the material world that's around me, even within my room that I'm in, now that I'm beginning to pay attention, I'm seeing more and more of what's immediately around me, and yet more than half of my room is behind me and beside me, for which my vision beyond my glasses is poorly able to pick up and perceive anyway. I think it puts into perspective the limitations of the human mind and of that extension that he is afforded by that supreme, perceptual, conscious entity. But not getting lost in the weeds, I think, of the darkness, of the type of darkness that we are talking about here, it is the reducing type. It is not necessarily the type that is there because it is unattended or not attended to. This is a type of darkness that is inherently reducing. And I think I should also say that I think it is allowed to be a type of darkness because man accepts it. It is partly because of his perception. It is his own decisions that limit his understanding and his perception of the world. It's a willful reversal of creation. It is an undoing of creation within his own mind. So the role of the Father here and the role of the soul is to recognize his place, I think, in the order of consciousness, and also to preserve consciousness, to preserve creation, especially in that of his own Son, which of course is by this sacrifice, the sacrifice of the current displeasure for future transcendence. A man of great wrath shall suffer punishment, for if you deliver him, yet you must do it again. So here we go. Now, the word wrath, this is something that I've discussed before, and it implies an extreme anger, a fury. Now, I think from my source here, it may be related to the Proto-Indo-European word re, W-R-E-G-H, which means to bend or to twist. Of course, this bending and twisting is in line and parallel with the concept of anger, that one clenches the muscles or the jaw, the hands, whatever, in that state of anger. It causes this tightening and this twisting. Now, the first part of this verse, I think, is combinatorially explosive. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of possible starting points. That the base, the foundation of this verse, at least at the outset here again, just concerning the first half, has so many elements that can be arranged in different ways that it's almost difficult to make sense of where I'm at and how to organize what I'm seeing here. A man of great wrath shall suffer punishment. In the first instance, we don't necessarily understand why a man of great wrath shall suffer punishment. But we know the verse is prompting us to think in that direction. So, okay, if it is indeed the case that a man of great wrath or great anger shall suffer punishment, why is it the case? And, by extension, what does it mean to suffer punishment? Now let us set aside utopianism. That is, that there is some mystical understanding, or mystical, perhaps, bedrock, this unknown thing that is spewing forth causality, that is tying together a verse like this. Again, a man of great wrath shall suffer punishment. It is like saying, I had this experience the other day. I was talking to somebody about the various carjackings that are happening in Chicago. Perhaps this crime is not unique to the day or the age, but certainly given certain recent political changes to the police department, Chicago Police Department, there has been less than many people would like convictions for various crimes. Now, one of the things that it has led to is an increase in crime, obviously. Now, carjackings are one of those things. And in this example, in this memory, I was talking to this person who lives in Chicago, and her friend had her car stolen. The car was found on the south side of Chicago. It was stolen from the north side, found on the south side, completely stripped of all valuable materials and parts. Later in the day, I was talking to somebody about this conversation, and I was sharing the experience that this person had. And it came to me the thought that when that person gets older, when that carjacker gets older, because undoubtedly it is a young person, probably late teens, early 20s, perhaps even early 30s. Certainly it's possible for somebody in their 40s or 50s to do it, but less likely. And I don't think it's less likely because of ability, and I think it's less likely because of life experience. But the point is, when I was talking to this person, I had suggested that whether they find themselves in prison because of, even if they're not caught for the carjacking, they're bound to do something else dumb to find themselves in prison, or that when they reach a certain age, for some reason my mind goes to the age of 56, but an age of reflection, perhaps one is looking back on their life and is beginning to acutely understand how finite their experience is on earth and reevaluating all of their experiences. That whether in one situation or the other, the person may be prompted to think. And once that thinking occurs, it is undeniable that, at least this was my assertion, that it was undeniable that what would set in would be a form of guilt. And when I said this, it was received poorly. That is, the person didn't have faith that this would occur. And there was something about his response in that little, smirk and a little laughter. It's like, yeah, it's probably not going to happen, which I agreed with deep down. Now, I do think certainly there are many instances in which people do things when they are younger that they regret when they're older, and they learn from, and perhaps it eats them alive, and they fall into substance abuse or whatever. Perhaps there are things that have happened to them in youth that were the cause of their perpetual distraction that led them to a life of crime. There are many possibilities here. But the lack, I think, of consistency in the principle by which I can understand how a man is judged left me a bit insecure. And I left that conversation wanting to know a little bit more about this judgment and about punishment, because I think the two are equivalent. Perhaps not exactly equivalent, but punishment is downstream of judgment. Now, the unfortunate thing is, when I read the first part of this verse, I have sort of a similar experience. I see a man of great wrath shall suffer punishment. But then I think of the man in my conversation that laughed at perhaps my naive thought. How do we know that a man of great wrath shall suffer punishment? Surely we should have a more clear guide to help us understand how such a thing can happen. What are the sequence of events that occurs? What is it about that the nature of wrath that causes one to suffer? But this is just the point. This is the point of the Proverbs. It is, and it must involve the individual. Some Proverbs are more direct, others are broader. And that's where the word combinatorially explosive comes into play. Now, the other interesting thing here about the first half of this verse is the use of the word great wrath. Now, wrath already implies something that is quite extreme. It is an anger that is extreme. Now, great wrath is additive. It is adding upon the extreme. Now, of anger, I think we have discussed before. I think that there is something useful to be said about incensed attention. That is, what the mind is afforded when it is under the constraints of the passions of the heart. Now, that particular language may not be very welcoming, perhaps, but we've all had the experience for which I think anger can get in the way of our the broader view of thinking. We become very tunnel-visioned. The anger is something that is at once very focusing, but also quite distracting. Distracting of the things that perhaps would give us perspective, for which the anger could be calmed. It could be dissipated. Now, I think one of the best examples of this, the provoking of this anger, is road rage. There are no shortage of dumb things that people do on the highway or on the regular streets. And there are no shortage of instances for which we can allow our passions to get the better of us and to participate in some potentially dangerous behavior. So what we have is the narrowing of attention that is focused on some injustice, some perceived injustice. The narrowing of attention in and of itself is not a bad thing. I've discussed combinatorially explosiveness. To get out of that environment in which there are so many different things to pay attention to, we must focus our attention. But the focus of attention, the way in which it's focused, matters. If it is focused under such extreme circumstances that the floodgates of the heart burst open, such that instead of a willful, directed attention, the attention is narrowed because of the pressure of desire. And I would say, insofar as we are subjected to the will of the heart, the desires of the heart, without appropriate balance by the rational mind, by the piety that is afforded to us by that higher processing. Now, to be more precise here, if I could use that word when thinking in such a manner, surely I think I can. Following the illustration of the narrowing of the heart or the narrowing of the attention because of the degree to which the heart is unrestrained and allows this desire and this passion to burst forth, I think I may be incorrect on a few different fronts here. But I'm uncertain. Now, I'll say that of attention, if things are going to be as I have laid them out to be, it would imply that the mind, that the higher processing part of the mind that is involved with, judgment and behavior, is number one, that this part of who we are is primarily involved in that attentive capacity. Now, I don't want to bump up against the scientific here. We need not do that. We are talking about experiences. And insofar as, what part of the brain specifically is responsible for another part, we can measure that. And we can know that. But in relation to our own experience, and to solve this dilemma of how anger or wrath leads to punishment, this is not the right way to go about describing that. Regardless of exactly where it comes from, I suppose it's important to understand that there is a difference between some lower processing and a higher processing. Now, the specifics of exactly where that occurs in the brain, I don't think it really matters, and how all of the passions are felt throughout the body. This is not necessarily needed on a particularly detailed level to move forward. Just as it's not necessary to understand the underlying substructure and neural substructure of the brain to be able to think. It occurs without that awareness and that understanding. However, when I said that the passions as they burst forth and crowd around that attentiveness by us, by the person that is actively attending or attempting to attend to something, I think it's correct. So I will not go back on that. But there should be a modification, I think, because the heart has this dual capacity. It has this ability to influence our attentive capacity, full stop. Both for good and for bad. Good in the sense that the heart has this capacity to direct the attention towards what ought to be paid attention to, in the sense of big picture, of longevity, of prudence, of righteousness. But it also has the capacity to restrict and to narrow, to focus on the short term and the immediate. And I think this function is useful in certain situations. This function in itself can be used to save us in times of difficulty in which fast action and a strong response is necessary. Like in a case of a physical struggle, for example, when our lives may be threatened. But in relation to the level and the appropriateness of the response, it is possible that we can misjudge, that we can let too much of the passions of the heart pervert our attention, such that our passions are disproportionate to the action that is required. And in such a case, I think that it increases the probability that we may suffer a consequence. Now, instead of saying something cliche, like because something is out of balance, then, of course, there will be some correcting mechanism to put it back into place. No, that doesn't really make any sense. Perhaps at some level it makes sense, but without the pieces by which it is connected, we cannot really find ourselves in that territory. But I think one answer must rest within the idea that there is an inappropriateness of the level of response to a particular situation. And I think the question, well, what causes something to be inappropriate? What causes a response, like in the case of road rage, to be an inappropriate response? I think one answer is the Herodotus answer. Not necessarily that he would give this answer, but because one of the quotes that I use by him often, that custom is the king of all men, that what is considered to be inappropriate is because of our cultural customs. And I think there's a degree to which that is true, but it is not an absolute truth, because within that sphere all we find is relativism, that what is inappropriate is only relative to the culture and custom in which we find ourselves. But I think in an absolute sense, it must be that inappropriateness, in addition to what I've described by culture, and it may be the case that culture is present without that of punishment, without the suffering of some punishment. The punishment would be cultural. It wouldn't be anything outside of that. So as we take that with us, and we try to find ourselves something more concrete and more absolute, I think what we can say is that the hyper-focus of attention, forgetting about the heart for a moment, although the heart is a crucial component in this verse and in this analogy, hyper-focus on anything means that we are going to be very attended to that thing. Now, if we are attending and intending, perhaps, to cut somebody off in traffic because we want to correct some perceived wrong, or perhaps we had a bad day, and now we're just sort of taking it out on somebody else. The attention is going towards that situation. It is going towards the situation in a particular manner. It's like a rocket that is re-entering the atmosphere at a particular angle, at a particular location. And because of its speed, because of the angle of entry, because of the location at which it enters the atmosphere, there is a predictive process by which one can determine exactly where that rocket is going to land. And I think similarly, we could say that of our behavior and our attention. And of course, there's always variables that we don't quite take into consideration. But in a general sense, we can have a pretty precise understanding of what might befall a rocket that enters the atmosphere at a certain speed, again at a certain angle, at a certain location. And also what might befall a man given his incensed attention in a particular situation, under a given circumstance, with a given set of restraints, with the given parties that are involved. And in some sense, his punishment, the way in which he suffers, is something that can be avoided, unlike that of this rocket that is sort of rapidly descending into the atmosphere. Man can choose the angle at which he enters the atmosphere. He can choose to focus his attention elsewhere. But if he chooses to step on the gas, he chooses to let the floodgates of the heart rage forth without employing that little adjuster within the heart that scales the passions, that allows the attention to be modified by that of the feelings, which of course is something fundamental to our experience. It's not as though passion and desire has no place in our experience. Of course it does. It plays a role in virtually all of our decisions and experiences. But it is a matter of how the heart and the mind are used together to focus and to attend to our experience, our life. Now, in some sense, we have found ourselves in that balanced territory. But what we are balancing here perhaps is not quite as concrete as we would like it to be. We have such a beautiful mythological narrative of punishment that comes down from on high like a lightning bolt that strikes somebody down when they have done something wrong, when they have transgressed. While there may be such process, there may be such law that exists, man, I think, by and large, not in every circumstance, of course, but he has difficulty, I think, interpreting this law. And as such, just like my analogy, I think, in the beginning of this verse when I talked about the conversation about how the people that convict crimes early in life may reflect on them later, I think certainly such a thing is possible, even though there may be a naivety there. And certainly also it is possible that a man may never come to understand. They may continue to live by that incensed attention. And in that respect, I think the attention is the very thing by which man is able to see, understand, experience the finer things of what is considered right and wrong. For if the person that had committed a crime, like this carjacking crime, they found themselves in prison and they use that time to reflect, and they come to some sort of understanding, then of course this process, this judgment will have taken place. Punishment perhaps will have taken place. There will be something, if an individual is going to atone for what and to adjust their behavior towards the good, they are going to have to attend in such a way. And that attentive process is going to involve discovering what the transgressions meant, or they can use that time to plan further misdeeds and further be, again, incensed. That attention can be further perverted. And in a way, that is also a punishment. Even if the individual, the heart of that individual, even by doing evil, they feel pleasure. That still, I think, is a form of punishment. It's a form of darkness. A man of great wrath shall suffer punishment, for if you deliver him, yet you must do it again. So we have a man that is effectively blinded by the excess passions of the heart. And in his blindness, of course, he cannot see where he is going. He stumbles. Of his stumbling, he doesn't understand why, but he is punished. Now, the second half of this verse, I think, really ties it together. For if you deliver him, yet you must do it again. Now, there are two things I'd like to talk about here. First, I think the big part of this is that one must understand deliver. The second half, of course, there is the implication, yet you must do it again, that this deliverance did not hold. Okay, so what can we say of deliverance? When something is delivered, it is brought from point A to point B, we can say. That after its journey, it has arrived to its proper location. Of deliver, we can also say that it is something that is provided. that we are supplied with something when we are delivered, that there is this furnishment. Now, if we think and we discuss the origins of this word, the word deliver comes from the old French word délivrer. Who knows if I'm pronouncing that right? Which means to set free or to hand over. Further, the word is a compound of the Latin prefix de or de, which means away from or out of, and the Latin verb liberare, which means to set free. So what can we make of this? To set free, away from, out of, to hand over, in this context, the man in whom we are considering, if he is to be handed over, he is to be handed over to something. Or perhaps he is to be handed over from point A to point B. And I think his place of, what can we say, of liberation perhaps, not of liberation, his place of movement is a vertical one. It is that of the earthly to the heavenly. But even that might not be the correct way to conceptualize this. For we are discussing a matter of attention, a matter of consciousness, of perception. And so we are considering surely a vertical of darkness and that of light. Now, heaven and earth makes sense here, but it's not entirely accurate because man does not find himself in the same condition as earth, even though his mind may be perverted and distracted. Further, we can say that he is moving away from something, that he is set free from some constraint. Now, there are obviously good constraints and bad constraints. In this case, we are talking about a bad constraint. And so, what then is this constraint that he must be set free from? What must he move away from? Well, he is moving away from, in the first instance, we were discussing his behavior. We were discussing wrath. Now, this extreme anger, we also discussed, is a polluting force. It is a distracting force. It is something that is uncontrolled and distempered. And because of this distemperament, he finds himself constrained within that darkness of mind. And I think at this point it's important to remember that this restraint can be both something that is realized and something that is implicit. I think in the more insidious sense, the restraint is implicit. That is, there is really no conscious awareness of what is happening. It's more of an acted out sort of thing, like an alcoholic that is lost within their addiction. Perhaps there are some alcoholics that realize, surely there are many that realize the state of their alcoholism, their addiction. But there are also plenty that are lost within it, that are so far down that path of blunting their thoughts, blunting their experience of life, and their ability to perceive reality, that it is almost something that is it is something that is beyond their awareness. Now, of course, this analogy can be extended into many different illustrations, different examples that are not as concrete as the pitfalls of an addiction. We can broaden it out to just average everyday experience of man. And all of the variability that he encounters. Going back to my analogy of the Psalms, I used often the illustration of a man that is sort of thrown into existence into a darkened room. And he doesn't know what's in the room, obviously, because he's unable to see, because there's no light in the room. But he can perceive to a degree. He can feel around the room, he can feel the objects. And eventually he finds himself to some degree of understanding. Certainly, it is of much lower resolution than it would be if he had the ability to see. And zooming out from this example that is relatable and yet foreign to most of our everyday experience, if we were to zoom out enough, perhaps consider ourselves a being that is more perceptive, that is able to understand reality to a greater degree of resolution than that of the human being, I think then we can appreciate the everyday average experience of man to be something akin to my illustration of the man in the darkened room from the vantage point of this being that is able to see farther into reality. And such makes us a fallen creature. Of course, we are not God. We are not the source of that perceptible light. We are not the source of meaning. We are not the source of goodness. We are the stewards of that light, of that consciousness, of that goodness, for which we can and have the capacity to unite the heavenly and the earthly. That of the pure material and that of the meaning and purposefulness. And what a punishment it would be for man to be denied or to be relieved of, to have the capacity removed such that he is unable to utilize that perceptibility of mind, or I should say that unifying capacity that he has. The ability also to find adequate perspective among the multitude of patterns that are perceivable out there in the world. The restriction and inability from such punishment to establish firm relations, to build a soul and a heart that is something that is truly gratifying and purposeful. For a man to be delivered and yet he falls again into this pit, into the pit of Sheol, into that pit of darkness, it is a difficult matter. It's difficult because there's great temptation, I think, to submit to relativism, that whatever is pleasing to the individual, even if he is delivered in some sense relative to the standard, to the cultural and customary standard. If he is an alcoholic, if he is delivered from his addiction, he no longer has it. And yet, a man of a certain persuasion, a man that has not truly committed to that of healing, will fall back into his addiction, back into that pit, again, that darkness. And as I've discussed before, this is low-hanging fruit, the analogy of the alcoholic. There are much larger, or I should say much more subtle patterns, larger in the sense that they are ubiquitous, that patterns of deception find their home in the heart of every man and every woman. It is unescapable. Hear counsel and receive instruction, that you may be wise in your latter end. Okay. So what can we say of hearing counsel and receiving instruction? Now, in the first instance, counsel is something by which we come together with another person or perhaps a group of people and listen to the advice or the guidance that is proposed. Now, the reason surely is a straight shot. Even at far distances, just like a person that is well known to us, we can identify them from a long way off by the way they move, by the shape of their body, etc. And I think this analogy applies here to that of counsel and how it can be beneficial to us. Oftentimes it is the foolishness of our behavior, of our own selfish conceptions, that we become blind to the way that things are, or to the way we ought to behave, or the way that the world outside of us is functioning relative to our interaction with it. And to receive counsel, I think it provides, even if the counsel is not all that great, even if it's incorrect counsel or incorrect advice or bad advice, whatever, at least we are afforded a process. We go through the procedure of listening, of taking in information, and if we do it honestly, that is, if we take in the information and actually consider it, it doesn't just, once it enters our ear, bounces off a few places and then it dissipates into the ether. That is not what I consider to be receiving instruction or to hear counsel. To hear instruction and to receive instruction and to hear counsel is to take it honestly, to integrate it, to try the advice of another. And it's not a one-off thing. I think it requires continual discipline and repetition for such things to be effective. Of course, it depends on the circumstance, for which there are many. There are many. But if, for a moment, if we can enter the illustrative landscape, we consider the self and the walls that form the boundary of that identity of the self. I think of an ancient city with various gates. I think of Herodotus's explanation of the city of Babylon. Now, it wasn't an explicit description for the case of describing Babylon and its structure, its form, but in relation to a military expedition, there was some illustration of the city. And what I got from that was a fairly sophisticated structure, a quite elaborate outlay, design of defensive buildings, of walls, of towers, of various gates, of an intimate relationship with the river that flowed through it, the Euphrates. And so in this manner, as we can identify a city as something, it certainly makes it easier to see when there is a wall around it, everything within it, this is the city. The self, perhaps a little bit more of a fluid structure, but nonetheless, the analogy of the gates, I think, forms this dynamic capacity, for which a gate is something by which a person can enter and they can exit. The gates that are embedded within the walls of the self allow for information to come in and information to come out and to go out. Now, depending on the number of gates that are available and depending on their state of openness or closedness, information can flow accordingly. And that is to say nothing of what happens when the information has entered into the city. This is just the base defenses of that self-identity. Now, in this way, a selfish person is one that has very few entry points. Even if there are many gates, they are mostly all shut, so that very little information enters into the city, for which it can interact with the mind. And perhaps I should say that if information gets into the city, and I don't just mean in a superficial sense, like walls are there to prevent certain things from getting in. It doesn't prevent everything from getting into the city. When it rains, the city gets wet. When the wind blows, the breeze is felt. There will always be some interaction with the self, with the outside world, no matter how closed off a person is. But certainly there are things by which the individual is able to actively filter information. Now, counsel, instruction, this is one of those things. And I think one of the fundamentals of counsel and instruction is that openness, that the openness of the barrier, that very thing that outlines the self, that identity. And I think the quality, the virtue that is responsible for opening the gates is humility. Humility is the thing that allows something to enter without perceiving it as a threat. Now, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about, well, how does one know exactly when something is a threat? I've mentioned bad advice. Certainly we should shield ourselves from bad advice. And to this effect, I think there's a difference between the debate that goes on within the city and the potential for an invasion by some enemy force from without. And I think there is an unfortunate reality to our experience of life. Well, I suppose it depends on how we view it. On one hand, it's unfortunate because things are largely unknown. There's a lot of difficulty, a lot of stumbling, a lot of error, a lot of potential danger that can accompany just existing and of learning, of trying to grow. On the other hand, it's fortunate because we have the opportunity to make the mistakes, we are afforded the opportunity to take the risk that just because something is risky doesn't mean that it is inherently bad. It just means that there is a potential for a negative outcome, but there's also that potential for the positive outcome. And of those situations for which I should back up and say life itself, I think, is this sort of gamble. There are very few situations in which a person can find themselves without being confronted with risk and adversity. I think increasingly, as we find ourselves in a society of increasing material prosperity, we are afforded a certain type of luxury that has prevented that traditionally oppressive force of nature, of necessity, had forced us into a mode of decision making that required a certain degree of maturity. The consequences for which we failed were much higher. It included starvation and extreme poverty. Today, certainly that risk is still there, albeit with the abundance of food, that risk of starvation is not quite there. I think the challenges in life have not been lessened, in a sense. They've been lessened in some ways, but in other ways, the potential has been transferred to other aspects of life. It has been transferred, the difficulties have been transferred to the spiritual domain, that meaningful and purposeful domain in which we question exactly what it means to live a good life and to be successful. In these days, I think good counsel and instruction are fundamental to navigating the pitfalls of the modern material economy. For as we have this increase in material abundance, and we are afforded a certain level of material comfort and prosperity, we lose that challenging aspect for which, because of the lack of necessities, we were forced into a mode of quick action and also quick reflection and determination of what is truly valuable. These days, because of our material abundance, all of the load has been shifted towards that which is meaningful and purposeful. I shouldn't say all of the load, much of the load. I think there is an unfortunate thread that finds itself throughout our society, throughout every one of our hearts, that it is pulled quite tight, in the sense that we are pulled to give towards something that is beyond ourselves and yet well beneath that of the heavens. And surely there have been many times in history where that has been the case. But given, again, the degree of material prosperity that we experience today in 2023, it seems to serve as a veneer, a facade. That is, it gives an appearance of well-being, when in fact the soul is something that is insulted and broken. And so again, good counsel, good instruction is the procedure by which we repair such brokenness. The latter half of that verse, that you may be wise in your latter end. Your latter end, perhaps the latter end of life. There are many devices in a man's heart, nevertheless the counsel of the Lord that shall stand. So we are afforded another opportunity to think about the nature of the heart. There are many devices. Device is an interesting word. Immediately my mind goes towards what I'm looking at in front of me. I see a few different devices. I see a remote control, I see a keyboard, I see a computer screen, I see a computer tower, I see a surge protector. In the modern day, our devices are our electronics. They are our phones. And yet, from the Latin, we have the meaning to divide. From the Old French, separation, wish, desire. when I think of a similar word, I think of divisive, which is, I suppose, a form of this separation or dividing. It is a disagreement. I think of decisive, which is sort of the opposite, is the bringing together, the settling, the definite. And so there are a number of things, I think, or a number of ways, I should say, that we can interpret this verse. In the first instance, in terms of the device sense, perhaps that we have come to associate device with a machine. In what way a machine divides, perhaps it's unclear. Perhaps it divides labor. Perhaps it divides an item or an element into its component parts. The machine is responsible for producing one element, and thereby perhaps it could be seen as something that is a division. Certainly there are many machines that both synthesize but also break down. By device, we can also mean a plan, a method, or a trick with a particular aim, some direction, some strategy, perhaps. Now, thus far, my heart analogy has become somewhat complex. That it is this part of us, the part of the mind that is beneath the cerebral. It encompasses our desires, our feelings, our emotions. And yet it has this strange will of its own. Perhaps we might say it's unsophisticated. Perhaps we might say that it is wise in what it is capable of understanding and of filtering. Certainly a wise heart is a heart that is tempered. It is formed by wise deliberation and consideration, by the previous verse, counsel and instruction. The heart I've been seeing as a sort of machine in and of itself. Inside of it, or perhaps I should say the heart, is a bit of a filter. It filters raw inputs of information from the external environment. It filters all of these inputs through that emotional filter, and it produces in us some response. Some fury of life. Within the heart I've described, perhaps this is something that can be spoken of its wisdom or of its general structure, the degree to which it is autonomous, that it has within it a worker, an industrial worker, a machine, perhaps a device, that I've been calling the adjuster. This little adjuster is the thing that, similar to a plant engineer perhaps, it assigns certain weights, that monitors various pressures. But what he is concerned with is designing or assigning weights to the emotions given certain inputs. And based on the nature of this adjuster and his temperament, the specific weights that he assigns to this filter, the degree to which it is open to feeling a certain way given a certain bit of information, is determined by his adjusting of those weights. Now, something that is a little bit more sophisticated than I think than just a filter is a sustained, it's a prolonged device. It is a plan. In this way, I think we see a greater degree of the autonomy of the heart. That it is not just a treatment plant that filters water, perhaps, and makes it safe for drinking. It is something that can attach itself to images, to ideas, to experiences, to imagination. And the feeling that is produced there, I think, can be housed there. It can continue, it can grow, and it could decline. But yet the heart, external to its capacity to filter information and translate it into some emotional response, perhaps the emotional response that prompts the human being into action or prompts his deliberation. The heart is the home to that, the desire, which is more than just a feeling, perhaps. Like I said, desire, or more in a more articulate manner, our emotions, by which we may come to understand as components of desire, are intimately linked and had developed a relationship with what I've just described, those images, those experiences, those relationships, those memories, those events. So perhaps we can say of the first part of this verse, there are many plans, there are many methods, there are many aims. There are many instances in which the heart and the adjuster, through their filtration, also sort out the other end. And upon their sorting, they form something that is not just a mess of feelings and emotions. There is an integration. Of course, the heart is one part of man's soul, and as such it must be in relation to its cerebral partner, of its behavior, of judgment, of higher reasoning, of the integration of sense perception, all of this. There are many devices in a man's heart. And so in such a way, as I've described this filter, I think, if anything can be said of the Latin interpretation, that of a division, a separation, what we are separating, what we are filtering, is that of the information in reality. And we are using it in such a way to make plans, to devise. Now, for man, of man, just like the air that he breathes, he uses it to sustain himself. In a similar manner, his perception, his consciousness, is something that he uses akin to the air to sustain his soul. Nevertheless, the counsel of the Lord, that shall stand. There are many lives that have been lived and are currently in the process of being lived out that use their breath for many different things. I think the expression that's interesting is save your breath. Perhaps a kind of a negative thing, but saving one's breath implies that of that air that we had taken in, so that we can express, so that we can verbalize, or just so that we can continue on existing and providing cells with oxygen, that it was wasted, either by some action or again some verbalization. And so by saving that breath, we would use it for other purposes. And that is the key, for other purposes. And what other purposes will we use it for? Well, in the second half of this verse, it brings to mind the counsel of the Lord, which would be an ultimate purpose, for which perhaps it's difficult for us to come to understand, but if we are oriented to some ultimate purpose, then I think through trial and error, certainly, we find what experiences are worth having, what is worth saying, such that we don't have to save our breath for something that's more, because we are expending it in the pursuit of what's more. And if we find it to be righteous, that is the thing that shall stand. The desire of a man is his kindness, and a poor man is better than a liar. Now that's an interesting statement. The desire of a man is his kindness. Now of desire we've talked a bit about here, just discussing the heart. Perhaps the nature of desire we haven't really discussed much, but we can get into that. I think the important word here is kindness. Now kindness, when I look at it, it begins to become moving away from the implicit more into the explicit realm, and it begins to look more and more strange the longer that I gaze upon it. Of kindness I see kin. Of kin I think of family, I think of close relationships. Of this ness, that suffix to the word, I think of equality, a quality of relatedness. Now, insofar as we've been talking about the hearth as this fundamental symbol around which man is oriented, around which he recognizes his own limitations, and from that place of understanding, he communicates with others, he reflects within himself, he goes through this procedure, this process by which he comes to understand what is true. Moreover, from that, of the hearth, we can think of the fractal structure of culture, how at the level of the individual, both in terms of the relationship to the self and to that of outside the self, the hearth is encompassing of broader cultural patterns that manifest because of these interactions among individuals. And we can see that the hearth becomes this engine by which we come to understand others, ourselves, the engine by which what image could we use here? The giant, perhaps, the giant that is above the individual, the collective, in a sense, how this moves. And I've discussed before about the alignment of this illustration of the hearth, That is, if this metaphorical hearth within the home is out of alignment with that of the metaphorical hearth of the community, or the neighborhood, the town, whatever, as it scales all the way up, this misalignment is a fundamental misalignment in, it can be value, but that's sort of beyond the pale to a certain degree. It is beyond the principle. I think the principle is more, if things are in alignment or misalignment, we can say something of a common mode of perception and understanding, or a mismatch of perception and understanding. And obviously, if the chain is broken at some point, the understanding at the level of the family runs into a problem at the level of understanding of the neighborhood or of the community. And that leads to ostracization, it leads to conflict, it leads to confusion, fundamentally, disorientation. Now, if kindness can be thought of as this word to represent a quality or characteristic of relatedness, and we associate that to his desire, so that his desire, the desire of a man, is his kindness. So his desire is the structure or that quality by which he is related to other people, to himself, to his beliefs, perhaps to his goals. Again, within that structure, family, neighborhood, town, city, state, etc. And of relatedness, we think of the definition, the state or fact of being related or connected. So now we have this view. The heart comes into view here. It is the home of our desires. It is this thing that can be unreasonable, distempered, and yet it could be something that is synthesized. It is something that is parallel to reason. It is something that is complementary to our experience. It is something that is in line to the facts of reality. Again, conversely, it can be something that is out of line with the facts of reality. Now, of our experience, the heart is fundamental. We cannot just say that our observation of the world at every point ought to remove that experience, because this is fundamentally a part of us. This is who we are. I think there is great danger in that abstraction of the mind too far away from the body, such that the body begins to suffer, it begins to atrophy and decay, while the mind explores various intellectual pursuits, all the while, again, to the detriment of the body, and to all of the ingenuity and power that the mind possesses, that it has gained through its years of education. It is not wise enough to relate itself to the body, perhaps to discover the elements of desire within the heart that make him feel connected and whole. The desire of a man is his kindness. Now I want to go a little bit further here. For the word kind, the etymology of the word kind, from Old English we have cynd, signed, which means nature or disposition. From Proto-Germanic we have kunbiz, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is race or kin. Then we have Proto-Indo-European, the word G-E-N-H, which is to give birth to. And so we have a fundamental, we have a relatedness, and we have giving birth to a new beginning, a beginning. And so the image that comes to mind here is that of the tectonic plates, which might seem like a strange analogy, a strange line to draw, but it's interesting such that the Earth is this revolving thing. Within it is this fiery hot core. And constantly it is moving. The mantle is moving such that new Earth is being born. Old Earth is being consumed back into that fiery center. Perhaps not it's imprecise, but the fiery interior, I can say. It's not quite the center. Now, in such a way, I'm imagining this first half of the verse. The desire of a man is his kindness. That there is this element of birth in which we can see with the process of, what would it be? What is that process called? The process that occurs at the mid-ocean ridges, whatever that is, where the tectonic plates are moving away from each other and that new substrate is solidified. So the parallel there would be, perhaps it could be understanding. It could be a new relatedness to the world. And to the world, I mean something that is separate from the earth. Material understanding, I suppose, it can apply to as well. But of the world, I mean more of of human culture, of human institutions, all of this sort of stuff that we find ourselves in relation to, whether or not we participate day to day with these institutions. No doubt their structure that it provides us within a society has an impact on us. So from this analogy of this giving birth to, I think we are on the precipice of peering into a deeper layer, or finding a passage within a cave that has gone from some narrow, if I back up for a second, there are all these videos on YouTube of people that go through tight passages in caves it's addicting to watch because it's very dangerous and they can get stuck in there and they can die. But sometimes they go through these narrow passageways that nobody has gone through for obvious reasons, and then they find this sort of break in this opening, where as before they can barely fit their body through it. They're crawling on their belly to snake through this thing, and eventually it's this massive cavern that is opened up. They could stand up and they could run around in it, and it's a strange and interesting experience. In a like manner, I think understanding this word kindness and the desire of man is the experience that we are having. So we're on our belly to a certain degree. I think we have come to a cavern, and then we've sort of returned to the belly to explore farther, and I think we're at the precipice here. So at this precipice, as we peer our head through this small passage, and we have discovered at the end of this, there is a new cavern. What can we do with this? Okay, so back to our tectonic plates. We have the birth of an new underlying substrate, which is the new underlying earth. Now, if the birth of value, or the birth of what is meaningful to the earth, let's say, is its continued material existence, or of its continued material proliferation, And perhaps it's not quite prudent to think of value in this way, but we're drawing an analogy between that of the earth and that of the material to that of the human experience, that of what we can bring to the earthly, to the heavenly, of the heavenly. And within our minds, within the conscious sphere, as we imagine the tectonic plates within the mind to open up, what is that underlying substrate that is revealed to us? Obviously, it's not the earth, it's not a material thing, but it is I think it's understanding, but it's more than understanding because that's vague. That doesn't quite get to where we want to be. It is more than just understanding. I think it is I want to say it's a relatedness, it's a connectedness, it's a kindness, but that, again, this is repeated territory. I think what is revealed here is that, but we have to be a little bit more specific. I'll say, I think, maybe in a theological sense, what is being revealed is a depth of experience, the ability to pay attention to things that are truly meaningful in such a way that all experiences, or many experiences, depending on the person's orientation to this process of generation and of relatedness, are able to really appreciate their lives, the place that they find themselves within their own experience, again in relation to other experiences, other people, institutions, etc. But I think fundamentally it is an opening up of potential. That potential, much like the earth that is born, we have to think about what value that it could potentially offer. Now, of the earth, it's hard to speak of value in this way because it's not a conscious thing. It's not a conscious being. It's not the human being. The human being is the thing that brings in the value to the earth. But insofar as something that is new that is created, we do have change. We have movement of these plates. We have, over the years, over the centuries, over the millennia, the movement of the land masses. We have the change of the climate on the earth. All of these things have happened within the experience of man on earth. Of course, they take a long time to take place. And I think that the software update, the separation of the tectonic plates to reveal the new underlying substrate, is much a similar process of generation within the mind. That is, it is a process of expansion culturally, understanding of linguistics, of information, of intelligence. I mean, we're on the verge of an artificial intelligence revolution that can augment the way that humanity interfaces with the reality in the world. There's many potential dangers here, but as far as we consider artificial intelligence to be a tool, much like a hammer is to that of framing and building a house, it can serve us in many positive ways. And I think one of the positive ways that it could serve us is in understanding. Now, I said that that's vague and it's difficult to describe, but understanding such that we stand atop of problems for which prior to the advance in intelligence and perception and relatedness that we had otherwise had been left in the dark, now our experience is filled with light. We have perhaps as we find ourselves in a melancholy and a new experience perhaps that we have found off of a continuation of old experiences and of old enlightenments, perhaps. In particular, I think of industrialization, I think of enlightenment, of material understanding, I think of the scientific revolution. And I also think of the extension of this into the modern world. I think of the First and Second World Wars. I think of perhaps a bit prior to that, Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and that their experience with the death of the old world divinity. And now we find ourselves here in 2023 with very strong, again, increasingly centralized institutions, of populace that is struggling to understand where liberty is in the modern era, and this overall cultural domicide for which America is experiencing, that we don't feel at home within our institutions or within our own communities. We constantly are struggling with immigration, we're struggling with each other, and there's this profound disconnectedness. Okay, so what? The desire of a man is his kindness. Such an experience, I would say, as another enlightenment. I think this time round, it's going to be a theological enlightenment, unlike our previous, which is more of a scientific revolution and enlightenment. This time, this expansion, this moving of tectonic plates away, such that the underlying substrate is revealed and it is solidified. This new understanding that rises to the surface from the mantle beneath, I think is going to be that of a reorientation to that divinity, the rediscovery of God. But the thing here is that this expansion, much like the tectonic plates, as the expansion of the conscious mind, as a sort of an intellectual revolution, a theological revolution, a meaningful, purposeful revolution, this is one part of that kindness that I discussed in relation to the etymology of the word kind. This generative, just to give birth to aspect, is just that one part. We have, from our Proto-Germanic influence, race and kin, which is a type of relatedness. It is a type of identity. It is something that includes boundary. It is something that includes I want to say experience. It includes fractally a structure that is very similar to the individual self. It is in some sense that relatedness and that connectedness. I think of molecular bonds in this case that bind atoms together, that bind different molecules together, perhaps. We could think about it in that level, but in terms of the overall, what the result of that web produces is a movement and an agency in and of itself. And I think that movement and that agency is something that is important to the first bit that I just mentioned there, that of the generative principle. Because as the new substrate is created, and perhaps if we continue that where the old is returned and then reduced within the mantle, the new produces and offers new perspective that follows perhaps new procedure or even old procedure, it doesn't matter, just correct procedure, provides us with change, much like change has occurred over the millennia with regards to geological distribution. Now, if we just look at one plate, we can understand the principle. But if we look at the entirety, and if we say over the years, and we do sort of a time lapse of the earthly experience of its change in form, we can greater appreciate how the whole thing moves together. And as we zoom out here and view that whole, we can zoom out from the individual and the individual connections between individuals to that of more of a collective view. And where we want to land on that collective, there's many different places that we can land. Now I'm looking here at this Proto-Germanic definition. I see race and I see kin. So that's a level. Both kin and race, those are two levels. Race, not so much. It's an interesting distinction, but it's not all that useful, especially in the modern day. So we can just sort of get rid of that. Now, kin is something that is interesting. Kin is sort of direct blood relation. It is a type of identity that is very personal. It's something that is personal, but it is without that of the individual self, though it intimately involves the self. And in this way, I think we can imagine, we can appreciate the dynamic, the family dynamic, as culture changes, as the generative principle takes hold, and that new substrate is brought to the surface. The dynamics within the family are going to change. Now, I think we have an unfortunate experience here in the United States. Now, I want to pull up the statistics about family life. That is, intact families and just intact families, mother, father, and children in the home. So, according to the U.S. Census Bureau in 2022, 65% of children under the age of 18 lived with two married parents. This is down 73% from 73% in 1960. So it has gone down quite a bit, almost 10%. And I think there's many different ways that we can view family dynamics and of the stability of the American citizen, perhaps. There's a lot of different avenues by which we can think about these things, but the general point here is that as we move within this new cultural landscape, I think the beginning is often difficult, because the new substrate needs to take time to settle and to solidify. All the while, the old is being consumed and it is being disrupted and destroyed. In the time that it takes to solidify and to become whole, there is a lot of argument. There's a lot of tension. And I think in that process, some damage can be done and powerful lessons learned. So, what I'm getting at here is the relationship of, or the nature of kin. Now, that brings me to the third aspect of the etymology of the word kin, and that is of Old English, the cynd, that is of nature or disposition. I think from within this generative process, our orientation changes, our nature changes, our disposition changes. And while there may be fundamentals to human beings and to human nature, I think that there can be, and there have been, periods of disruption and confusion, such that it takes time for reorientation to take place. It takes time for strong family bonds to be reignited. It takes time for the family to be reoriented and strong citizens within a free society to accept certain responsibilities. And we have to wonder exactly how all of this sort of thing plays out. If the human being, as a free agent, is able to handle that sort of disruption and software update that occurs. But it is no doubt that the software update is occurring. And it's more than just a software update, it is the way in which we interface with reality that is changing. The desire of man is his kindness. A fundamental reorientation of the heart of man to his newfound institutions, perhaps. Now, this doesn't have to be progenitive, prospective. It can be something that is, and I think I began by describing this verse, trying to outline it as it is. The desire of a man is his kindness, and I think that I had gone through that process sufficiently to include the heart, the seat of desire, and its orientation to the hearth, or its participation in the hearth, and then kindness, which is something of a generative, it is something of a fundamental, it is something, again, of relatedness, of identity. And so it's fun to examine this verse in relation to the modern era, but as the verse stands within itself, I think we have to remember the hearth, we have to remember the intricacy of the heart and the desires therein, and we have to understand the relatedness of that intricacy to himself, to others, but ultimately the relatedness and the orientation towards the good and the just, that the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? That traditional saying. Towards the divinity, towards that divine peak. The divine peak is the pillar around which the hearth ought to be manifest. Now the thing is, the higher up we go on that mountain, the closer we are to that hearth. And now we can't, as human beings, I think it would be quite a stretch to say that we can drink directly from the tap. We are always this agent that is trying to go back home, that is always desiring to go back home and to try, and even if he strays from the path, he begins to become aware of what he is missing, and he will go back and try and find it, try to reestablish. The desire of a man is his kindness, and a poor man is better than a liar. Now this relative comparison here, I should be careful with that language, but the comparison is something that we've seen fairly often in the Proverbs thus far. The comparison between that of a poor man to that of something else. So in this case we have a poor man is better than a liar. Now in the first instance, I think, as I've said many times about poor, or that of poverty, is that it can extend to realms of life that are well beyond that of the material, to beyond that of the assets that one holds. One can be poor in many different facets of life. One can be poor or deficient in character, in strong relationships, poor in love, certainly poor in a material circumstance as well. But the point there is that poverty is not limited to the material. So now when we say a poor man is better than a liar, what does this mean? Now there was a proverb a while back that I had took particular interest in talking about the word better, because the word better is not something that we think about very often. This is a word that is so ingrained in our culture and in our understanding that it remains implicit mostly any time that we mention it. But for something to be better than something else, it again has to be relative to something. It has to be, if I could use a different word than relative, or a phrase that I can use other than that of relative, perhaps, that it is relative because of, or I should say, it is comparative, it has some relation, it has some respect with respect to, has proportion to something else. I think all of these words are indicative of sharing in something more than or less partial than what we say when we, what we suggest when we say that this is relative given this. And if we think about the word in proportion, I think of something that is part of something, as I've just mentioned. That it is a part where the thing in question is comparative to something else. Of comparative, I'm looking at a definition here. I see perceptible by comparison. And that's an interesting sort of thing. That something is perceptible by the way in which we imagine it to be relative to something else. And of course the absolute, which can be seen as an antagonistic word or an opposite word to that of relative, it seems to be the case that an absolute must be necessary for a relative to take place. Now, much like a web, I would say like a spider web that has many different connections, or like blood vessels with different anastomoses, different areas of connection, I think that it's easy to get lost in relativism as a way to understand the world or understand a phenomena. Because in the case of the blood vessels, in which there are multiple different connections, there are redundancies. In the brain, we have parallel processing, which we can, which perhaps serves different functions, but also has this aspect of redundancy to it. This relativism is a narrowing of perspective, because if we zoom out, the blood vessels, they serve a particular purpose. Everything serves a particular purpose, regardless of the redundancy that is built into that system. And it is for the series of purposes that are held by a particular system that the human being is concerned with. These are our heavenly spheres, I suppose. Now, I'm making a fairly broad generalization here, but I'll continue nonetheless. And from my standpoint, the absolute, or the highest of purposes, is the one that we compare things to, that ultimately are relative. Of course, we can compare other things to other things in a parallel sense, but ultimately, as the analogy of a singular light bulb that is lit at night, if there's a sufficient absence of light, the light bulb itself and the light that's emitted into its immediate environment can create a perceptible sphere of illumination. And it's almost like a tangible thing. It almost seems like one can touch it. Now the light, of course, extends beyond that. And within that sphere, within the light itself that is outside of the bulb, the thing that produces that light for us to perceive, I think it's easy to get lost in all of that space without recognizing the source. And the example, of course, is not all that easy to get lost, because we can see clearly that it's coming from the light, and that it has essentially a finite area for which it can be dispersed. And I should say that its finite area is made known by the different sort of layers of perceptibility. I mentioned that sphere that's around the light bulb, by the immediate capacity that it has to illuminate the surroundings. Of course, things around it are lit up, and the light bulb itself would be seen for miles, and it's not until we travel far enough away from it and it is diminished from our view then we can say for certain that the light is not perceivable anymore. But just in terms of that sublayer of light that creates that effect that illuminatory halo-like effect around the bulb. I think it provides a good analogy for when we say something is more illuminated than something else. We say this based on its degree or its separation from that central point. The central point being the light bulb, or the source of the light. So in a sense, on our illuminatory illustration, if we imagine that the thing that is closer to the light is better than something else, or something that is more illuminated than something else is better than something else, and I struggle here a little bit because I have to wonder about the nature of that illumination and the degree to its goodness. And I don't mean necessarily the source of it. I mean the derivation, the branches that it emits. And I say that because of the existence of man and the possibility of a singular individual, of course, accompanying a sort of, or having a sort of mind. And of course, he is able to perceive, he is able to understand. He brings a certain sense of illumination, given his consciousness and his experience, to the world. And yet it could be adverse, it could be negative, it could be evil, it could be wicked, it could be foolish. And I suppose of this we can say that it is a degree of illumination, but it is not. It is misplaced, perhaps we should say that. It is not illuminating the side of reality that goodness would otherwise illuminate, I suppose. Now, I struggle with that a little bit, and I think that's something to come back at a later time, but staying with this verse, that poor man is better than a liar. In this sense, in this light, an interesting expression, the poor man is shown more clearly than that of the liar. The liar, perhaps, has this illuminatory effect to him, but he is shrouded. His face is covered in this darkness. We can't really see him all that well. It is as if the light bulb, I'm thinking about a cornfield at night, the sun has set, and there is a light bulb that is hung from a light post. And everything that is emitted from it, from that light bulb, is lighting up the surrounding area. But it has only a finite ability to reach into the earth, to the world, the earth, whatever. At some point, we can imagine ourselves, if we stand directly under the light, we will be very illuminated. And we can imagine there is evil that lurks around in the periphery. And the periphery is such that we are able to see and hear and perceive. And yet it is so diminished that we don't quite understand exactly what it is. And it makes it inherently dangerous because it chooses to hide itself. Now, people that are at the edge of the illumination of that light, let's say somebody that is stalking us, that wishes us not to see them, perhaps they are just at that point for which we can see kind of a figure, but we're not sure if it's a human being, if it's an animal, whatever, or if it's beyond the field of view. Perhaps they're in the corn, and we can hear them. Perhaps we hear voices. So they are not illuminated in the sense of literally illuminated, but they are weakly illuminated by the perception of mind. In this way, I think in this category, the liar is represented. The liar is someone that is weakly represented by perception and by that illumination. By goodness, surely. And I think what it is saying here is just because a man is lacking of something doesn't necessarily mean that he is worse off than a liar that has more. And now in this case, I think it's easier to see just from a purely material perspective. Because once we get into the weeds of when one is poor of various different things or wealthy of various different things, then we have a lot of comparisons to do, and that would be too much for the purposes of this verse. But again, the poor man in this case is more resolute. He is easier to see, he's easier to understand than that of the person who willfully says something that is false, something that is, they use the darkness to cover themselves, just like in the example here of the light bulb that illuminates this cornfield under which we stand, around the periphery of that light, which circles somebody that wishes potentially to do us harm or to remain hidden. And if somebody chooses to remain hidden, it is likely that they are up to no good. The liar hides themselves within the corn maze under that falsehood, that deceit, so that their motives aren't necessarily made known to us. And it is only until the opportunity arises that they choose to reveal themselves. Perhaps they never do, but their purposes ultimately lie beneath. Their purpose probably is the thing that is illuminated, because that is the truth, what they're after. Now they may be after bad things, and what covers them is their lie. What covers them in that darkness is the lie. And the poor man, of course, here is not the liar. Now, you can have a poor man that lies, obviously, but there's this suggestion that this poor person in question is not the liar. So I think that will be the end of this episode. And I will continue next time with Proverbs chapter 19, and I will be in verse 23.